Greetings. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Today, we're going to talk a lot about my current research study, giving you a lot of detail. And it's a real pleasure to have this conversation. One of the reasons I became a faculty member, and I love my choice of jobs, is having these deep intellectual conversations on the whys and the hows of research and scholarship and knowing about the domain and talking about that with my peers, with faculty, with doctoral students, with some practitioners who are really into these deep questions. And so I enjoy the opportunity and thank you for doing that. My understanding is I'm going to take about 45 minutes here. We have a session afterwards for Q&A and discussion, so I'd ask you to hold your questions till then. So let's get to it. Today I'm going to talk about a 14-year ongoing participatory action research that is clearly long-term and also large scale. One of the great benefits of working in a university context is that we can chase our questions where they take us. This was certainly not my intention to take 14 years to work on this, but as we'll show you, it's evolved and why it's evolved since then. And it's really one of the few places left in society where we can have these long-term inquiries, engagements, and discussions. It is also large scale in the fact that it is global in context and taking on many, many different institutions. So, what is it? Well, the problem or research question I'm looking at is, what is the definition of a librarian or librarianship outside the context of an institution, namely a library? And I'll talk a little bit about why it's important that we develop such a definition. To answer this question, I used a participatory action research approach, which we'll talk about in a moment, but incorporating a series of mixed methodologies around elite interviews, participant observation, revelatory case studies, and site visits. The results that I will talk about today include a large conceptual framework, shown as a large entailment mesh, a core definition of librarianship that is emerging through this work, and finally, a curriculum that takes these ideas and concepts and applies them within an area of learning outcomes, of skills, and makes it a little bit more concrete. After the results, I'm hoping to lead us into a conversation around the significance of these results, primarily a significant shift in librarianship and in libraries in terms of service, their core skills, approach to neutrality and advocacy, because it turns out that when you sort of begin with the concept of participatory human systems and librarians, life changes. But let me give you some context and then we'll jump into it. So the context is that really this study began with the end of a previous study, which I'll talk about in a moment. Along the top there are a series of research projects and funded research in which I've conducted parts and pieces of this study as a whole. And some of those, for example, the notion of the Salzburg curriculum developed with IMLS funding, it's been directly around my research and results. In some of them, say the MacArthur-funded reference extract work, it has been a part of, where most of the outcomes and purpose was around a tool, in this case a credibility search engine, but my research certainly learned from and contributed to that work. In the middle there, you'll see the significant outputs of this study in the form of publications, research white paper to the Office for Information Technology Policy at the beginning there, participatory networks. MIT Press published the Atlas of New Librarianship. Expect More came out of consortium funding efforts. MIT then put another one out on new librarianship, and etc. These publications are both documentation of results in the study, but also serve as platforms for continued engagement within the library ecosystem, if you will. The idea being not simply to say, well, this is what's done, or here's the conclusion, but here's the current thinking and where we're going. What do you think? And once again, keeping very much in line with this concept of participatory action research, that it's not just about making a study, finding a conclusion, and walking away. It's about a constant iterative connection with that community, developing and building tools and understandings. Along that bottom row are just some demonstrations of the international nature of the study. Those are significant places for either data collection, feedback, or engagement within the library community, as I sought to bring a larger than North American perspective to this research. I'm going to begin then talking about the study, as I mentioned, by talking about the end of a previous study. This is a white paper that was produced by commission from the Office for Information Technology Policy, and they wanted to figure out what is the impact of, now this is 2007, what is the impact of growing social media within a library context? This was in response to some legislation put forward through the House of Representatives called the Deleting Online Predators Act, or DOPA, a really appropriate name. And DOPA would have built on the Childhood Online Protection Act to not only talk about needing to filter within public schools and public-facing computing within public libraries, but to begin to say what needed to be filtered from types of services to specific services, which would have been some rather unprecedented amount of government control in terms of speech and access to information. I'm happy to report that it never passed, but it was the prompt that the Office of Information Technology Policy within the American Library Association, they wanted to know, how did this fit into particularly social media? We talked about Library 2.0 and social and Web 2.0 at the time. What was the implication for libraries? The result of that study done with my colleagues Scott Nicholson and Joanne Silverstein was the idea that looking at this interaction, looking at social media, looking at what was happening in this, was a matter of learning, talking about a learning lens. I'll admit that when we began looking at this, we began thinking, well, are people online collecting friends? Are they collecting conversations using a rather institutional context? And what we came to the conclusion was that no, they were seeking to learn. They were seeking to understand and sometimes expand and sometimes contract and sometimes reinforce worldview. But they were seeking to make meaning and understanding by having this direct interaction. And when you focus on learning, you focus on it is an interactive process. So the result was a learning as the foundation of what we're looking, that we were looking at participation and participatory systems. That meant that instead of thinking of us as an information dispenser where we had users coming to an interface, whether that was human or technological, gathering some materials and consuming that, we were really looking at learning as an interactive process, that when people were coming to libraries or Facebook, or at the time MySpace, they were looking to control the systems by which they learned and understood the world. This meant that we needed to look at participation, that participation became a fundamental desire once you bring on this learning lens. And that's why we began not using the term users or customers or consumers, but members, and the notion being a member of a community. The focus here was on knowledge and knowing, and that came out of conversation theory, that an information model looking at the idea of information need and information expression and information distribution didn't truly capture what was happening. So the end of this study, we ended up with a framework looking at libraries as learning, looking at libraries as places to learn through conversations, and those conversations are scalable. Conversations can be between two people, two organizations, two institutions, or it can go the other way within the individual, what past would have called cognizing agent, but today we would simply refer to as metacognition or critical thinking, the idea that we are debating and discussing things within ourselves, coming to agreements, and that's how we begin to establish a worldview. The problem, though, was that when you talk about participation and learning, talking about an institutional context and talking about the definition of what a librarian was limiting what libraries could do, or rather how they could explain what they were doing in service to their community. So this led directly into defining what is librarianship outside the context of an institution. The reason this needed to happen was first an inadequacy in the definition of librarians. An inadequacy because we weren't accurately defining them, but because we were attempting to define them, what I will argue is the wrong way, we were leading to really interesting and bizarre conclusions. What I discovered was that social media was simply highlighting an inherent human nature that libraries were reacting to, librarians were reacting to, not some brand new focus or form. So what do I mean by inadequacies, the definitions? Well, starting with something like the common definition. So here's an example out of the Oxford English Dictionary, that a librarian is a person, typically with a degree in library science, who administers or assists in a library. So a couple of problems with this. First of all, the idea that they have a degree in library science may be true if you look at that within a US context or a North American context, but what do you do with places like the Netherlands or Belgium that no longer have formal library programs at all? What do you do when you take, say, the head of IMLS, who has a background in banking, or the head of the British libraries, whose background is in broadcasting? You have lots of librarians that don't have a degree for one reason or another. So that's an inadequate definition. But one who administers a library. Once again, we have plenty of people who don't have a library science degree that are acting as librarians, and frankly, really good ones, such as Chris Borge, the director of the MIT libraries, who's doing an amazing job not only with that library, but through areas of open access and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Or assist in a library. Well, we have plenty of examples of people who assist in the library that aren't librarians, from everything from clerical and janitorial staff to security guards to heads of IT and human resources. So this doesn't quite fit. We also have librarians that aren't working in a library. People working not only in places like Elsevier and places like OCLC, but in places like Google and Netflix and places where they're using their librarian skills and worldviews, but not necessarily within a library. So this definition doesn't quite fit. And I'm not even going to go into the fact that the definition of a library itself is inadequate. And so you're building an inadequate definition on an inadequate definition. But, the good point is in research, we are not in any way stuck with what Oxford tells us. He says, looking sheepishly over at the dean. But we really have other ways of understanding this. We've always had that way. So one of the ways that is long-term within the field of librarianship, including research, including scholarship, including advocacy, including training, including accreditation, is linking the work of a librarian to the work of a collection or collection building or maintenance. A few examples. These are the core competencies of librarianship. Final version was 2009, but these are the most recent. And you'll see things like the definition of service, the concepts and so this is, for example, in reference, defining reference as the concepts, principles, and techniques of reference and user services that provide access to relevant and accurate recorded knowledge and information to individuals of age groups. In other words, reference job is to get to stuff. And yet we know that, having done a lot of reference research, there are things in instruction, there are things that we point to, there are people that we connect, there are activities that we engage people that have nothing to do with a collection. So we also see this in instruction. The principles related to teaching and learning of concepts, processes, and skills used in seeking, evaluating, and using recorded knowledge and information. I'll take a moment here just to be really upfront with you. Using PASC, using learning theory and dialectic theories, the idea there is no such thing as recorded knowledge. Knowledge is a uniquely human process. When we communicate it, it becomes information, it becomes an artifact, it becomes a mechanism, it becomes a record of it, but it's not knowledge itself. So a lot of the definitions built around our competencies, built around how we educate, how we prepare people, is based on this concept of collections and materials. And yet, when we look at what librarians are doing through things like maker spaces, through things like human libraries, through things like instructional sessions, workshops, going out into the community for literacy instructions, all of these things that are happening in a library don't fit this definition. Used to talk about, in one of our projects, we had a phrase called pizza, pizza, book. And the idea was that you would have a great session and you would serve pizza. So you could get people in and they'd come to the session because they get pizza, usually academic libraries. And then when they weren't looking, we'd slip them a book. Meaning it wasn't enough to have a great speaker or a great instructional session or, in one place, storytime yoga. It only seemed to gain value if there was a collection involved, increased circulation. So this thing began constraining because of all the things that libraries were doing that in response to a community, and the community was demanding of libraries that had nothing to do with the collection. This became very apparent when you look at libraries in the extreme, in the digital library domain of the early 2000s, with National Science Digital Library being one example, where they tried to break things up into collection building and service building and coordination. And the idea was that they would give funds to someone who would build a collection. You would give funds to someone who would build services such as search or metadata generation or visualization. And there'd be one people that would harvest all the collection, pass it off to the service seamlessly, and things would happen. The problem was that when these digital libraries went to go collect those materials that they expected from collections, they found organizations. They found schemas, ontologies, taxonomies. They found visualizations. They found graphics and the way it was designed. They found that there was no such thing as a collection without a service, that a service was a collection, that collecting itself, service, organizing, service, providing access to, service, circulating, service, and that when you look and evaluate what librarians are doing and their effect, you had to look at it from a service context. So we see that that didn't work very well. We also see that the idea that librarians very much took on, when we became library and information science, some of the things that information science took and were brought over into librarianship were brought, frankly, imperfectly. And that was this concept of a user, that we did user design, user interface, that we did user information seeking behavior. And we did this all from the idea that we had an information base. We were taking these people and we were providing them materials to consume. So there was an artificial dichotomy between the user and the producer. I want to be really clear. I don't say that this is indicative of all information science. Many of the people right now watching this have done brilliant research where we understand that that distinction is usually a non-distinction, that people are producing data, information, understanding, knowledge, and product all the time. But in librarianship, it was seen very much as a disconnect. And so we had to get past this limitation. And once again, social media at the time was making that very apparent. But when we were trying to define what a curriculum was, what libraries could do, what librarian services they were enacting, how we evaluated the value of those librarians, these definitions kept getting in the way. It was made very clear. This is a Aspen Institute study that was done on public libraries, and they put it very succinctly. I think it's the first sentence of the report. The time has come for a new vision of public libraries in the United States. Communities need public libraries. More people are visiting them, etc. But communities' needs continue to change. That's not just a matter of we went from books to ebooks. That really it was the idea of how do we get context. We needed to go beyond the idea of providing materials for a learning process and truly engage that learning process. That's why, for example, the research statement is not what is the definition of a library redefined. It truly is of what a librarian is. Because if libraries are institutions, participatory systems meant for learning, we have to look at the human part of that. We have to look at the participatory part of it, the knowledge part of it, and that means we need to look at librarians. And when you do that, you can begin to define what a librarian is outside of a library or a building or an institution. And you can truly understand what are the skills and the core values and such. And that releases you to really think about the innovative work that librarians are doing and why they're doing it. So, how do we study this? Jumping into methodology then. Pardon me. The first thing that I need to make you aware of is that this study is very long-term and large-scale, and part of that is because it builds on the notion of participatory action research. So action research is the notion that comes from a naturalistic inquiry, comes from a constructivist bent. We can spend some time on meta-methodological considerations if you'd like. You gave me 2 months to prepare this presentation. I have a lot of slides on meta-methodological studies that you will not see. But action research is you have to engage in the community, particularly because you seek change, you seek to understand what that change is, and you seek to be part of that change. There's actually a fair amount of action research that occurs at for example, the University of Texas over in the COM school. There was a whole center devoted to participatory action research in sociology, a lot in college education. And the notion is you work within the institution, and to truly understand the complexities of what you're doing, you must be part of that. The separation of simply observing something is insufficient for the understanding of that environment. The largest scale way of thinking about this is something that chemists McTarget and Nixon called a spiral of inquiry. And the notion goes that you plan, you sort of look at the environment, you try to understand what change is being brought about. It goes back to Lewin's old work in change management. And you plan, what are you going to do? You then act, you implement some sort of intervention. You are usually the intervention through training, through tool building, what have you. You observe what happens during that process and reflect upon it. That reflection is not the end. it's then a matter of going and replanning, reacting, reobserving, reflecting, and you do this constantly until you either achieve the change that you're seeking or you understand why you may never achieve the change that you're seeking. I also want to be clear that this makes it look like these are nice separate steps, but oftentimes these things get bunched together on a regular basis. I mean, when you're acting, oftentimes there are things you did not anticipate. That's the whole idea behind action research. And so oftentimes in the middle of action, you're observing to see if it's working and you're planning for any contingencies and what may happen. But these large-scale cycles of engagement and action and research really characterize my study and what I'm doing. So what is the observing part of that? Because oftentimes that's what we talk about in terms of methodologies, which is how do we know what we're doing and if we're making a change and what we do next? And that's through data gathering. So I want to walk you through primary set of data gathering. So action research certainly incorporates the notion of multiple methodologies working out. For those who may not be familiar or may not like participatory action research, this is very, very similar to Creswell's concepts of the integrated multi-method approach, where the researcher is the instrument, and you're constantly sort of preparing the instrument, sensitizing the instrument, gathering the data, reflecting and analyzing. And so through these elite interviews, that was a really primary way of gathering methods. So let's take a look briefly at that method. Over the study, there have been 49 interviews with 46 different people. And this is a way of gathering data. Now, the elite interview process, this comes from Marshall and Rossman, is that you're looking at someone who has a unique perspective on the environment that you're working on. That it's not simply a matter of interviewing exhaustively or across different strata or spectra. You're looking for people that have an intimate understanding of a situation, but also a broader concept of the environment that you're working in. And in libraries as institutions, and as librarians in terms of how they promote and look at these skills, that tends to be at the administrative level. We'll show you different things. So I'm talking to library directors or heads of departments or people working across multiple institutions. The interviews themselves are semi-structured interviews, once again, based on looking for people with some form of elite status, either based on their reputation or based on their title normally. And initially, this was very opportunistic in terms of who I was speaking with. And then once you sort of get in and begin talking with folks and they begin referring to others, you move into a snowball strategy where you're looking at understanding who else might have a useful perspective that you're bringing in. We'll talk about this in just literally a second in terms of how that impacts things like equity and diversity in the pool. Because increasingly, as libraries have evolved and emerged and our understanding of them have emerged, and particularly when you're talking about engagement and participation within a community, issues of equity, diversity, inclusion become really important really quickly. And so you need to begin to make sure that the elites are not necessarily the exclusive sides of different characteristics and demographics. Give you a sense of what that looks like. These are the interviews broken down first by role. Not surprisingly, the primary role here is administration, library directors, heads of programs, heads of different departments. Then followed by consultants. What are consultants? Well, consultants aren't just meaning literally people who work on sort of for fee on a given task. Consultants, as they're characterized within my study, are people that have this sort of broad perspective, but they work across different institutions. For example, Eric Borgenstein, who is currently at the National Royal Library of the Netherlands, has been instrumental in not only building libraries in Delft, but also in the UK and London and Germany and really across internationally. So he's a consultant in this sense. Faculty. Talk to ourselves, particularly in the idea of how we gather data and how different areas fit together. One current area where this is happening, not surprisingly here, around artificial intelligence, data gathering, and data analysis. And librarians, people who may not have these significant roles, but have a significant story to tell. I'll show you that in a moment as well. Gender distribution, not completely uncharacteristic of the domain of librarians, and certainly better representation than what you see at the director of administration level. I want to talk, though, about this third slide, race, because it's obviously very important for the field, and this tells a story, and it's not a great story to tell. So sharing my data. I want to be open and transparent, but I also need to show you that this demonstrates why I use primarily qualitative methods and qualitative understanding, because this graph does not tell the full story. Couple of things. One, as the idea of diversity and getting diverse views and how diverse librarians need to be to match the diversity of their communities became more apparent, more important, I adjusted the data collection. So if we look within the past year, you'll see that I'm beginning to get better in terms of race, in terms of collecting that data. The other part, though, is as an international study, race and ethnic origin has some interesting challenges that you can't capture well in data. When you talk, for example, about interviewing or gathering data from someone of Asian descent, it's very different to gather that data when they live and work in Chicago, Illinois, versus when they live and work in Taiwan. And so understanding the role of race and diversity can change with different international contexts. And one of the, I think, aims of this study is to better understand the concepts of diversity and inclusion in this international context so that we can have shared stories and shared strategies. So all of this represents a point in time and cumulative effort, but doesn't really demonstrate the trajectory that we're headed on, which is more inclusive and needs to continue to be more inclusive because, for example, missing a lot of indigenous populations, missing a lot of people with Asian background, talking about diversity, and we're going to talk at the end about methods that I'm putting in place to gather that kind of data later. So in addition to the elite interview data, to the actual sitting, having conversations over a prolonged engagement in a semi-structured way, the notion was to gather what's happening specifically in a given setting, to gather a deeper perspective on some of the things being discovered within the interview data. And that was done through the notion of case studies, and particularly the idea of revelatory case studies. A revelatory case study, this is Yin's work in case studies, is the idea that not simply you capture an event or capture a place or phenomenon in a case, but that you assume that that case is going to have larger understandings, that it's going to be, in the words of qualitative methodology and naturalistic inquiry, be more transferable than other settings. So the cases that were developed here at places like the Upstate Medical Center in New York, or the Fayetteville Free Library, or the Pistoia Public Library in Italy, or the Frisk Lab, which is a maker space in a van that drives through all of northern Netherlands. Those case studies were developed through interviews. Now, these are unique interviews. They're not counted in the previous 49 I showed before, because these truly do seek to capture across the spectrum of participants in a given case, and not simply the person at the top who may have the broadest view. But in a case, you're really trying to get a thorough view. Through focus groups, through those people who are participating, in this case, libraries, staff, but also then the community members who are engaged and how they're benefiting and engaging. Through observation, through sitting, watching what's going on. Through a lot of document analysis, looking at, for example, policies that were produced, handbooks that were produced, promotional materials that were produced in these different cases, and how those really work across different settings. And then through member checks, which is going back to the participants within the case study and saying, did I get this right? Did this make sense? The third major way in which I'm gathering data around this new definition of librarianship, trying to define without the institution what are the bounding mechanisms, if you will, is through participant observation. Obviously, in something called participatory action research, one participates. And so participant observation is the idea that I am engaged in and working within these settings. So where elite interviews, I'm talking with people and asking them to reflect and really probing their understanding. In case studies where I'm observing primarily and seeing what's happening, in participant observation, I am truly part of and appear with the participants in the ecosystem. So examples being workshops, where I am either taking or participating and sometimes leading workshops on given topics, such as how do conversational practices, how do participatory practices, how do knowledge practices work in a given setting, and tool building. So here are just some examples of the different participatory events, the different things that we were doing, from reference extract and escape, which are software development projects, so building tools. And reference extract, it was the idea that librarians are a trusted community. Can we extract and sort of transfer the trust a community has within libraries to search engines based upon ranking results, based on those kinds of credibility determination of librarians? In the case of iLead USA, it was the notion of training multidisciplinary librarians from across a state and eventually across 10 different states to come together and learn about leadership through technology. So we were teaching technology, but really it was an attempt to teach leadership, community engagement. This is an example where these weren't just teams of librarians across types, but they all had to have community members that were part of these intensive training sessions. So being in there, and after every session, working on with evaluators who are giving us data on comprehension and affective learning within those settings, making adjustments and training that way. Working in different workshops on people as they are encountering issues from social media, from allowing greater participation to understand. So the idea behind these is to actually get in there and work at it, if you will. Lastly, the notion of site visits. And I just want to give a little forecast. I'm going to show some of the results of these different methodologies, which may help clarify the methodologies themselves. 33 site visits. Those site visits are from across different library types and certainly different locations, particularly in the notion of international locations. The type of library is an interesting question when you are seeking to define the role of a librarian outside of institutions, because types are assigned to institutions, not to individuals. Some may self-identify as I'm an academic librarian or I'm a public librarian, but when you take away, the question is, what are you as a librarian? Then the idea of, well, do we have equal numbers of academic libraries and public libraries and K-12 and medical libraries represented becomes less important, because you're looking for what are skills that span those types. Still, it's important to understand and gather that data, if for nothing else, to communicate out and attract other librarians and other communities into their participation. So you can say, I understand you're an academic library. Let's see what it's like to be a librarian, whether you're in an academic or not. You need to understand that setting to invite them in. And as I was talking about with the interview collection, a lot of these site visits are in, and increasingly in, non-US locations. So gathering an international perspective, what spans boundaries when we're doing this. So, some more general comments on the methodology. I've collected thus far 127 different data collections, or data collection points. They range everything from those interviews, which includes the audio and or video of the interview themselves, and normally an automated transcript of those that can be used for data analysis, finding materials, and connecting, as well as examples and documenting and illustrating. They also include things like site visits. So this is a write-up of different site visits, in this case to Oslo and different libraries. Here is how that data collection has worked over the 14 years to give you a sense of the span. And also I want to point out a few examples of what's important in this data collection. For example, you notice that in 2009 was a pretty busy year in terms of collecting data. That is data that will not shock you, ended up being the basis of the MIT Press book, The Atlas of New Librarianship, but it really was this collecting and starting and making sense, and this transition from the library as a participatory agency to a librarian as a participatory entity. That took a lot of work and looking around and finding out what works, what's common, what's not common, so hence a lot of data gathering. I'll also point out a severe limitation of this approach. If you look at 2013, it's a pretty short year. Turns out I was recovering from some major medical procedures. And so when you are the data instrument, once again, as Creswell would say, and you're not working well, you're not collecting a lot of data. The last thing I want to point out, which I think is useful to know, is if you look at 2020, you see something that's going on. You see a lot of interviews in 2020. Obviously, that's a lot of COVID, that you can't do a lot of site visits, you can't do a lot of in-person observations, but you can do a lot of interviews in an online environment. But also, this was very much a deliberate attempt to create more diversity in the database that we were looking at, gathering people of different ethnicities, but also gathering data and understandings from people in different contexts and country settings. And so that's a way of sort of adjusting the participatory study as you go, as you begin to identify blind spots, as you begin to identify new opportunities or hesitations, you can make adjustments. A very quick image of where the kinds of data collections were across the country, across the world, if you will. And you'll notice, obviously, a huge concentration in the U.S. because that began as our study. In fact, you'll notice a huge concentration on the East Coast because that's where I was, and that's where the data was collected, and that's what was most available. But you can see that it begins to spread out around the country. I'll point out a few things. One, obviously we need greater representation in different parts of the country, but the major limiting factor is actually language. And back to the insufficiencies and limitations of the instrument, I can speak English. That's about it. I speak English and TCP/IP and Google Translate, but that's usually not enough. I will also say that a lot of this work, while not directly part of my study, the ideas of it, the data collection, the conversations and things that I can learn from are occurring internationally. You can see that, for example, in George Prado's work down in Brazil. You can also see that in translations, for example, of some of the different materials and books into Spanish, Catalanese, into Italian, into Chinese, and currently into Arabic as a few examples. So the ideas are getting some vetting, and I'm getting some of that feedback, but I don't include it because it's not a systemic way of collecting data at this point. So let me now switch to talking about some of the results, and I'm going to begin by showing those results by the methods in which they were collected. The elite interviews. So one of the elite interviews and early ones for the book came from Dr. Noah Adley. She is, at the time, she's now a professor at a university in Egypt, but at the time was the deputy head of technology for the new Library of Alexandria. And her experience, which was simply astounding, being in the Library of Alexandria during the Arab Spring and the Egyptian uprising was amazing. Talking about being there and how the community during riots and looting, primarily at the prompting of the Mubarak administration at the time, the community itself formed this human chain around the library to prevent it from being damaged, from preventing it from being hurt, even though Mubarak's wife was part of the board and it was seen very much when it was first built as part of that administration. It had over the years through service become owned by the community, and the community literally protected it. This kind of story, this kind of data is useful because, one, it talks about what is the role of a library. No one, when they were designing the library and looked at the front steps, assumed that someday that would be a perfect place to put a 30-foot long protest flag that protesters would put their hands on every morning as they went to the squares to call for the ouster of the regime. But this is where you begin to gather that data and that story and what it was like when they knocked on the door. It also is very much open from a methodological perspective to triangulation. So 2 years after that, Jennifer Alardi, who was at the time master's students in one of my classes, came to a lecture, heard all about what happened in Egypt, got on a plane, went home, and it turns out she lived in Ferguson, Missouri, and with the killing of Michael Brown led to major protests and crackdown on the government through use of military technologies. And here was a setting where talking with her about what did she do, which was bring in pizza because the kids were hungry, in terms of bringing in activities for children and creating normal spaces, which, by the way, very much fit with Scott Bonner, who's the director of the Ferguson Public Library. It begins to triangulate what is the role of a librarian in these sort of very extreme settings, and do these concepts of participation, of learning, of meaning making still work in that environment. Just a really quickly example of what some of the case studies look like, and I will warn you, this is by far the ugliest slide of my entire presentation, but because it was a participant-produced object, it is of great value. I went to the Department of Justice Law Library and talked about how do librarians support lawyers, not what does a library do, how do the librarians support, and through acquisitions, through reference, through different services. And this developed into a sort of new methodology for developing case studies called conversational analysis. And the way it works is you identify different parts of the community. You'll notice those along the bottom through legal staff and Department of Justice law libraries, vendors, etc. And then what are some of the regular and important conversations going on within those communities? So in this example, the far left column is what legal staff, lawyers, do when they're about to litigate a case. They begin by understanding legislative intent of the different laws and regulations that were put in place. That turns into a development of what's called the theory of the case, and they produce briefs, which is what they submit to the court. Their arguments they submit to the court. And they also then look at the life of the law. That is, once a law was passed, what happened through Westlaw, looking at case studies, looking at different findings, different procedures, and precedents set up within the court case. Once you do that, what we began doing in this case was using the Department of Justice law librarians to begin to align the different services and materials that they offered to these parts of the conversation. So under brief production, as a lawyer is developing this brief, they're providing ad hoc reference services. They're doing research on expert witnesses. They're providing, yes, books and materials from their holdings, etc. This kind of mapping exercise leads to the case study. It also leads to things like, well, what services are we offering that don't connect to any of these important conversations, and where could we do a better job? So this is what some of the case studies look like. And lastly, what some of the participant observations look like is working with the Philadelphia Free Library, working with community members where they wanted to create centers, that is, places where different parts of the community could come together, participate, work together. So working as one with them to develop policies, procedures, and proposals, we proposed 3 different centers. One called the Entrepreneurium, which is not remarkably about starting up businesses, the Writing Center for authors and readers, and the Music Center. And these kinds of participation emerge things that you may not see normally. For example, each of these groups, so businessmen, authors, and musicians, wanted different forms of governance. They wanted different things in their space. The Writing Center wanted a quiet space to write and a salon to interact. The Music Center wanted 2 grand pianos on a stage because not only did they want to be able to try out and sort of work music amongst them, that's, I'm sure, very grammatical. You can tell how musically inclined I am. You also had situations where their major need within the urban core was a place to perform. The performance was what they wanted to do, and they saw the library as a place to do that. All right, so moving on. Let me give some more high-level results or key results that come out of this study. The first is an entailment mesh. So this is a map that was first published with the Atlas of New Librarianship, and I'll zoom in a little bit. Each one of those circles you're seeing is what Pask would refer to as an agreement. An agreement isn't the idea of it's a fact or a piece of knowledge, but it is a piece of understanding in which forms our action and our worldview. And so, for example, one of the findings was that knowledge is created through conversation, and that comes from conversation theory. So once again, let me highlight for a moment that thread, that knowledge is created through conversation theory. Conversation theory itself discusses what are art, agreements, language, memory, conversants, etc. And so you see these different understandings. This is the picture of librarianship outside of the context of a library. Each one of these agreements is then further supplemented not only with what the agreement is, knowledge is created through conversation, or in this case, conversation theory, but also what points to different theory. So conversation theory is the biggest, but we also formed things like social constructivism, the idea of complexity theory in a bit. We also then connect to data. So the participatory networks paper, for example, provide a great amount of data behind this, and then other materials, so linking to Joan Bechtel's discussion of scholarly communications, or Pimentel's work on classification as conversation, cybernetics, user participation, satisfaction. So it gives us a broad way of bringing lots and connecting lots of research and methodologies from across the discipline into this understanding. The other primary mean, and you would think is the primary result, is that definition. What is the definition of a librarian when you're not saying it's someone who is involved, connected to, or working within a library? Well, I discovered that you can't, from the data, you can't say that in one simple way. It is a combination of 3 different things. It is, first of all, the mission. What does a librarian seek to do? A librarian seeks to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their community. They help people get smarter, make smarter decisions, and find meaning. Where does that come from? Well, from our case studies, from the theory itself, conversation theory, constructivism, what have you. But that mission is insufficient to define what a librarian is because other people certainly share that mission. You would think that we, for example, as an institution of higher education, or we as professors, share that mission. Google could say they share. Many publishers say that's their shared mission. And actually, it's an advantage to have a mission that is not completely unique because it indicates who's good partners and ready to work with. But once again, insufficient. So you also need to talk about the means by which librarians implement that mission. Those means, as defined through my work and really building on the work of Martis Hoffman and Marshall when they were talking about digital divides, are providing access to knowledge. So it may be books and materials to spark knowledge. It may be other people. And it's also two-way, and then it may be the world to the person. What does that mean? Well, many libraries, for example, are setting up podcasting where they help their members come in and produce podcasts. What they're doing is providing that as an access mechanism, not to the material, but that the world can hear their ideas, share, and begin that conversation. So access, knowledge, training. In other words, you may have access to the book on the topic, but if it's not in the language you can understand, not helpful. Environment. Are they in an environment where people feel safe to engage? I like to think that libraries are safe places for dangerous ideas. Can they come in and feel like, and that's where we get a lot of librarianship's values around privacy and preserving privacy, but it's the notion that people feel they can engage and learn in this environment and not be penalized for it. And lastly, motivation. That is, what is driving them to do this for internal reward or some external reward. Still not enough. The mission is very much about what they're doing. They do it through this environment, but other people do this as well. So then we talk about the values in which we do this with, right? So Google may seek to improve access, but do they do it for learning, openness, diversity, intellectual honesty, intellectual freedom, and safety? You need those three things together. This then got translated into a curriculum. That curriculum is talking about what librarians need to know, whether they're working in an institution or not. They do it through some framing or values. This is something called the Salzburg curriculum. It's developed at the Salzburg Global Seminar out of an IMLS-funded project. And so what are the skills? Generally, they fit into these categories of things like transformative social engagement, technological skills, management skills, asset management skills. Things don't radically look different until you dig a little bit deeper. So taking transformative social engagement, because we're talking about people, because people are learning and engaging and changing the environment, and because they can't be neutral when they do that, they have to understand issues of activism and advocacy, social responsibility, how to do critical social analysis, how to understand how to create systems in context, sustainability and conflict management. Changes what librarians are doing, and they do this not only in a building called a library, they do this in businesses, they do this in research teams, they do this on legal teams, what have you. So what are the significance of these findings? Well, a couple of things. If librarians are in the knowledge business, as I argue they are, they're in the conversation business. That means that they need fundamental new skill. We've for a long time defined what a core skill of a librarian as information organization, cataloging, metadata, shelving, the whole bit, and information seeking. That's where a lot of reference fits in. But we really need to talk about facilitation as a core skill. That is the ability to engage an individual or groups, get them to converse and seek agreement, even if that agreement is only agreeing to disagree, and doing it in a productive and civil environment. And so that facilitation becomes a primary new skill. We've just begun at the University of South Carolina a whole core course on community engagement and facilitation for just that issue. The participatory nature of knowledge requires a participatory approach to the work and structure of libraries as institutions as well. So turning this around, which is we begin to define what a library is from defining what a librarian is, we know that we need to change things in terms of how libraries are of a community, not for them. How they truly do co-create information and co-run a library, and there is the idea of shared ownership of all the processes. And leading to a post-neutrality librarianship that we find is when you look at a human being and they are unable to be without bias. They have biases given their background, their understanding. If you think libraries are good for a community, that's a bias. If you think that the best knowledge comes from the most diverse sources, that's a bias. That means it's a built-in view, and they can be very positive. They can be negative and need to be controlled as well, but very positive. That means we're not neutral. And so how does it work that libraries are about improving communities, and how does that fit into the context of social justice and social infrastructure? And finally, developing a new normal agenda, looking at what librarians need to do once we come out of COVID and what they need to advocate for. Libraries have always been involved in things like broadband, but the answer to "it's in our buildings, come join us" doesn't work when those buildings are locked and closed. And Wi-Fi to the parking lot, while happy and useful, is not the best solution. So librarians need to make sure, particularly that diverse communities have good universal broadband access. Workforce development and training, preparing people to work in a post-COVID world, preparing for all the jobs that went away and what's going to come next. Expanding voter access and democratic participation, ensuring the health and mental well-being of our communities. We have a lot of people, including myself, that have suffered during this, suffered separation, suffered anxiety, suffered disconnect. And we need to talk about how we restitch that community together. And once again, what is the role of libraries and librarians in their response to different crises, from a hurricane and a flood to a pandemic? Moving forward just briefly, the next phase, well, a little too briefly, next phase of that inquiry spiral I talked before, I'm under contract to revise the Atlas, which sounds like a book deal, which it is, but it really is the idea of updating and caretaking and redeveloping that entailment mesh, the conceptual network, so that it takes care of some of the areas that were either underserved, newly emerged, or need to be better understood, such as critical theory, artificial intelligence, equity, diversity, and inclusion as primary values. And looking at the implication for participatory approach in shaping communities beyond libraries. To do that, we're hosting a series of workshops here in the fall, in areas working in these different areas. The symposia will be around equity, diversity, inclusion in a global context, post-neutrality librarianship, international influence, what works across borders, and once again, this new normal agenda, and keeping with the participatory style. It's not just me having an event, but working with other librarians or at other institutions that want to be part of that conversation, such as the National Library of the Netherlands, the British Library, the Library of Congress, but also IFLA, IMLS, and such. So I've gone a little bit over my time, but I want to thank you very much for giving me your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.